Yeah, I'll mention.
But yeah, we know Jeff is a big time birder, so
All right, why don't I go ahead and do introductions and we can go ahead and start with the presentation. You can feel free to comment as much as you want on the chat that's already begun as we get going. But let me introduce myself. I'm Andrea Tolsman with Illinois Ornithological Society. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm happy to have Matt Young and Nathan Goldberg of the Finch Research Network here with us. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of our guests and then let them take it away to talk about Hawaiian honeycreepers. So our first guest is Matt Young. He is the founder and executive director of the Finch Research Network. He's been observing birds for, I think, over 26 years, living in central New York, and has been studying everything from birds to orchids and bogs and fens. He has a Bachelor of Science in Water Resources and a minor in meteorology from the SUNY New York Systems, and a master's in ornithology from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry and Syracuse University. He's been studying finches and been doing all kinds of work that he's going to share with us tonight, along with the work that they're doing in Hawaii. He's also a social worker and does other kinds of work and teaches classes at Cornell. And then our other guest is Nathan Goldberg. He has been the project lead for the Hawaiian Honeycreeper Project. He's a graduate of Cornell University and a tour leader and guide for red hill birding. He's an avid birder for over a decade from the Chicagoland region. Many of us will find him to be a familiar face tonight. In 2020, he set the Illinois Big Year record, seeing 341 species over the course of the year. And he's also been guiding private trips throughout the Hawaiian Islands since 2021. And it was at that point that he reached out to Matt Young and the Finch Research Network to get involved in helping raise awareness around the conservation crisis that's been facing the Hawaiian honeycreepers in Hawaii, as well as other birds. So tonight we're going to hear about that project and the conservation work that needs to be done. So with that, I'll let you all take it away. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well,
thanks.
thanks, Andrea.
Sure.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I believe I guess I've been reelected as iOS vice president as well. So we're grateful that Matt has agreed to join on with us and give a presentation here today. But today we're here to talk about the Finch Research Network and the Hawaiian honeycreepers conservation crisis. So without further ado, I just want to share a little bit of where we're going to head today. Our first steps today are going to be with Matt highlighting really what the Finch Research Network is, also known as FiRN. Then we're going to be jumping to the Hawaiian Islands, a far jump from Chicago, starting with island formation and the evolution of the avifauna on the islands. Then going island by island, talking about the endemic species of finches, the conservation requirements and initiatives that are taking place, and then ending with the conservation crisis itself, the tools that were being used right now to help these birds, and what might happen in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt, who's going to just share a little bit about FiRN and how this all started.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan, and thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Illinois Ornithological Society for having us. I think I gave a talk for this group like last year, right? So a little bit of this, I'll give a little bit of an overview of what we're working on and where we're going. Some of you might have heard some of this, so I won't give you too much background. But I've had this relationship with finches going back to my time. It all started at Yellowstone. I was not really a birder. I just bought a pair of binoculars in the summer of 1995. And I was there at Lower Falls and a flock of crossbills flew in, and talk about life-changing moments, which you don't know it at the time it happens. I remember watching these birds forage and seed coats falling down and just going, what a crazy adaptation. And then, my whole life shifted, my whole worldview shifted. And then I started to look at birds every day. As we all know, we have a lot of us have a story where that just kind of opens our eyes up and makes us look at things in a different perspective. And then from there, crossbills have kind of become, or have been a mainstay in my life as far as, identifying the crossbill call types. And it was really the Crossbill Project that was the genesis for, the founding of the Finch Research Network. It was kind of in the works for several years before we launched it in 2020 with the Finch forecast that we put out now. And, I think a lot of people know me through the Crossbill Project at this point. A lot of people send me recordings from around the country, and I know there's a couple names on here I believe have sent me recordings over time as well. So next slide. So, I mean, the biggest thing is like why we landed on the name network. We were kind of playing around with, do we call it institute, initiative? Network really implies like everybody can be part of this. I mean, we want everybody, whether you're an artist, sound recordist, a citizen scientist, just an enthusiast or a researcher or a writer, everybody really can play a role. We're always looking for people to collaborate with, always looking for people that want to write material as well. Again, the founder of, we kind of like gave an ode to when we launched this to Ian Newton and Ron Pittaway. A lot of people might know Ron's name. Ron now, unfortunately, Ron passed this last August, but he was the founder of the Finch forecast that was put out since 1999. And again, the Finch forecast has become a big part of what we do now as well. And so, like I said, everybody can kind of get involved. If you want it all, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me. I can be found at, info@finchresearch.org. Next slide. And all things Finch, when Lily and I have a book coming out with Lillian Stokes in September, the Finches of the United States and Canada. And, when we started talking, she's been an entrepreneur for so long, 35 guides, her and Don wrote over the years. This actually be the 36th guide. She was like, you need to make FiRN all things Finch. So, we have research, kind of 4 big areas that we're focused on: research, education, conservation, and wellness. And the Winter Finch Forecast is one of the biggest projects, comes out every fall. We have the Red Crossbill and Evening Grosbeak projects, which there's several pieces to each one of those, which I won't go into details tonight. You probably heard more details in last year's presentation. But we do have 3 iNaturalist projects now going, one around the Winter Finch Forecast, where you can become kind of part of the Winter Finch Forecasting Network. There's an iNaturalist project where you can kind of read methods and go out assess food crops for finches, but there's also a foraging project for evening grosbeaks and red crossbills. Our biggest conservation project is this Road to Recovery for evening grosbeaks. It's 92% decline since 1970. I was just at a conference in West Virginia a week ago at the National Conservation Training Center. We're kind of there collaborating, getting together, talking about the 5 Road to Recovery species, evening grosbeaks again being one of them. Then, of course, the Hawaiian Honeycreeper Project. And then, there's, one of the biggest cohorts of birds that feeders are finches, no matter where you go really in the world. And there's some things, there's more studies that are coming out about the wellness or well-being aspects of watching birds at your feeders. And believe it or not, there's some things we could do to help as far as disease or collisions in backyards. Finches tend to be susceptible to both more than most species because of their sociality and flocking dynamic. So we're kind of like starting a little bit of an initiative around wellness for finches, wellness for you. Next slide. I won't go into this too much, but like I said, the Winter Finch Forecast started in 1999. I started to do the crossbill piece of that for Ron in 2010. He really was the one that started the enthusiasm around finches. I mean, as far as wintertime goes, finches are kind of the one, that everybody hopes to get every year. I should add that Tyler Orr now is the winter finch forecaster. He's also a board member of the Finch Research Network. And that forecast is really driven by almost 100 citizen scientists now that give us reports and give us assessments of finch foods across the boreal from coast to coast. And again, I'm encouraging people, please look up the iNaturalist project if you want to get involved in the coming year. And like I said, red crossbills, lots of different call types, 12 different call types. We actually described a new one about a year ago, type 12, that's most common in the Northeast. That's kind of what, I think we've identified. I've listened to somewhere between 15 and 20,000 red crossbill recordings at this point, which is kind of crazy. I know it's way too many for any normal, healthy human being to be listening to that many crossbill or that many recordings, but it's an ongoing passion of mine, and it never really gets boring, to be honest with you. Again, Evening Grosbeak Project, we have a focal or a working group, an international working group, trying to look at this. We're only 2 years in. We're looking to take this project out west. We kind of have these focal groups looking at, obviously they're a spruce budworm bird, meaning that their populations cycle with these outbreaks of spruce budworm, but we're also interested on, looking at habitat change, how much vehicle window collisions play in a dynamic, disease, and of course, climate change. And this is just some of the tagging data. So we have over the last 2 years, we've, it started actually, like it says here, in 2017, but just in the last 2 years, we have put out 46 satellite tags and 85 radio tags. So you basically have nano tags, like the Modus Tower tags, or the radio tags, and the satellite tags. We get readings on them daily if they're getting enough sunlight. They're powered by the sun, pretty much. We've had upwards of 13,000 points now from those 46 tags. We had one individual that was giving us readings for almost 2 years that made up for about 3,700 of those points, actually. We called him Champ, that was tagged in Maine, and it's basically been going back and forth between Maine, New Brunswick, and Quebec, but we just unfortunately lost contact with him about a month ago. But it's a pretty cool story. And then, like I said, Wellness for You kind of campaign, just more and more studies coming out all the time about the health benefits. I think we all saw this during COVID, where, the safe place that we had was to go out our nature center or look at birds or a bat. I had people in my family that really hadn't engaged in birds, even though I was, like my brother, Timmy, didn't really engage in birds until COVID, and actually bought feeders, put feeders up. I think all of us, or many of us, have a similar story to share like that. And so that brings us to tonight's, topic. It was about, I don't know, it was a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Nathan came back from a trip. He actually had ran into a friend of mine in Hawaii, Bob McGuire. Bob reached out to me before he had flown back into the mainland and said, "Hey, I think you're going to hear from Nathan Goldberg. He wants to get involved. He wants to do something to help raise." That's really what we're doing tonight. We're trying to raise awareness here in the mainland, because a lot of people don't know, how serious this conservation crisis is. And at this point on this slide, I'll hand it back over to you, Nathan.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Matt. And it's been a winding road of a passion of mine with Hawaiian Honeycreepers ever since high school. I remember when I volunteered at the Field Museum here in Chicago, I actually gave a talk on Hawaiian Honeycreepers for one of the lab meetings. And so this has just been an ongoing passion of mine ever since. And so today I really hope to share some of that passion with all of you and explain a little bit more about how these finches got there, why we call them honeycreepers, even though they're finches, and the conservation crisis that they're all facing. So in any event, all the birds on the right side of your screen are the radiation of Hawaiian honeycreepers that evolved over the span of about 4 to 5 million years from basically what we think to be a common rose finch or something similar. So it's a Cardulian finch, and what likely happened is a big flock of them arrived on the Hawaiian Islands in search of food or during an eruption cycle and never left. But with that in mind, we have to sort of take a step back and figure out quite why they got there and how they got there to begin with. And that actually starts with the formation of the Hawaiian Islands to begin with. So the Hawaiian Islands are actually one of the most isolated archipelagos in the world, and they are part of this Hawaii Emperor Seamount chain, which you can see going from the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia south and then east across the Pacific Ocean. And this entire seamount chain was formed by hotspot magmatism. Essentially what happens is the Pacific plate is moving over what's known as the Hawaiian hotspot, as you can see in the bottom right of your screen, and it pokes holes. This magma from a mantle plume essentially pokes holes in the crust of the Pacific plate, and as the plate moves over it, various points make their way through the plate and create islands. And sometimes they don't actually make a full island; they just make mounds of magma under the ocean surface, and it's only really visible from outer space. And so this entire seamount chain took somewhere between roughly 40 to 85 million years to form. And the plate is moving over the hotspot at roughly 51 kilometers per 1 million years. And so where this becomes really interesting is when you start to think about how the plate is moving, the age of the islands is correlated to that. And so the farthest west of the Hawaiian island chain is the oldest island, and the big island, or Hawaii, is the newest island. And so when we talk about the Hawaiian Islands versus the archipelago, the graphics on, well, both of these graphics is an aim to sort of share with you the difference. The archipelago consists of up to 137 islands. I will admit 138 is in process of being formed right now. The oldest member of the chain is Kur Atoll, which is up in the far northwest corner of your graphic on your right, upper right. And the newest island, is actually underwater. It's known as Loihi, and it's under about 3,000 feet of water. So when we think about the islands, I'll just go back one slide. As you can see on the bottom graphic, Kauai is almost 5.5 million years old, and the Big Island, or Hawaii, is only not even 1 million years old. And that sort of holds up when you actually visit these islands. Kauai is covered in lush forests and is very low in elevation, whereas Hawaii, or the Big Island, is covered in, there's multiple volcanoes that are still active. There's active lava flows at times. There's dry lava patches that you'll experience just by driving around the island. And that's due to the fact that it just hasn't had enough time to really let nature run its course and sort of take control. So with that in mind, it's important for us to also get a sense as to how far away Hawaii is from everything. It's no less than 2,700 miles to Tahiti, 3,800 miles to Japan, roughly 2,300 miles to Alaska, and similar to California. And those are the closest points of land. And so it makes Hawaii one of the most isolated archipelagos in the world. But yet birds did make it. And so historically, the island was a tropical paradise. This is known as the Makawi Cave. It's a cave system that is on, I believe I want to say Maui, if not Kauai. I think it's Maui. And I've actually been here before. I happened to visit it during a trip through all 4 of the major islands, so it's sort of blurred together. But needless to say, this cave system, every bird that you see in this picture did exist and was found at this cave system. We know this because a lot of these birds, over the millions of years that they inhabited this island, actually fell in or got trapped in the cave system in the pool, and sediment eventually layered on top of them. And so there's these subfossil remains that indicate this incredible diversity of birds that no longer even exists up until the late 1700s. And so we'll get into that right now. Before 1778, which is when Captain Cook landed on the islands were inhabited by the Polynesians, who came actually to the islands through multiple layers of colonization, if you will, right? The islands were uninhabited, and so they found their way through wayfaring mechanisms, which essentially is to read the stars and figure out where you are in the ocean accordingly. And this was all done with no contact with what we know as the Western world. And so it amazed scientists to figure out that people could take a boat from Tahiti or nearby and end up on the Hawaiian island chain, but they did. Unfortunately, they brought with them the Polynesian rat, and that caused one massive layer of extinctions, especially for land birds. And so here you see three examples of some really fascinating birds that have no relatives left on the island. There's these gigantic geese that used to live on the islands that were likely flightless. The Kauai mole duck, which we believe to have acted similarly to a kiwi and was essentially blind and flightless and would walk around the forest understory. And then at the bottom, you have the Kauai stilt owl chasing two now extinct species, Wahi grosbeaks and the Kauai o'o. And all of this happened, the owl, the duck, and the moanalo all went extinct well before Captain Cook and his posse were able to make landfall, and in lieu additional researchers as well. And so one really incredible graphic that blows my mind is, if you've been to the Hawaiian Islands, you may be familiar with the bird on the right side, the nene, which is about the size of a Canada goose, and it is in that genus. It's a branta. But fascinatingly enough, that's the smallest living representative of this goose radiation that found its way to the Hawaiian Islands and diversified there. And there were these geese that, especially the second from the left, the turtle-jawed goose, was known essentially to walk around and feed on plants no differently than a tortoise does. And because it's flightless, the way it inhabited the ecosystem and engaged with it is now trying to be replicated on some of the islands by introducing tortoises, because they have no other way to spread seeds and to replicate that style of foraging. With that in mind, though, we move into present, in our present wave of extinctions, if you will. So post 1778, Captain Cook has made it to the islands and is greeted by an incredibly rich Hawaiian native culture. The communities were very rich in a number of ways, but one of which is they created a lot of feather helmets and capes for ceremonial purposes. These capes can be sometimes 6 feet plus across and are massive, massive, massive. And yet all those yellow feathers you see on the cape came from these o'os, which is an extinct family of birds entirely. And they only have yellow feathers in select areas of their bodies. They're not all yellow birds. And so you can start to begin to understand the density of birds that used to occur on these islands and the loss that we have faced. That cape that you see came from the late 1800s. And yet that, I will tell you right now, was not the cause of the extinction of o'os. Nor was it the cause of any of the conservation crises that you're going to be learning about today. The Hawaiian community and the native Hawaiian community, were intertwined with nature. They certainly used it to their advantage in a number of ways, but there is a reason that all these extinctions happened after 1778 and not well before. These communities have been there for a very long time and developed a lot of traditions surrounding nature and the birds. And so while clearly the o'os were pressured more than other birds and possibly led to their sort of more susceptibility, I would not argue that the reason for their extinction came from these capes and the feather collection techniques. But just briefly, I want to get into the radiations that are on the islands aside from finches. You have the honey eaters. So we thought, which created the OOs in the family Mohoidae. But it turns out, after genetic work was done, that these are actually closest related to waxwings. So they are not from the Australasian honey eater clade. They actually came likely from North America through waxwings. And funny enough, recently, I think a year or two ago, maybe less, a flock of Bohemian waxwings found their way to the islands and were vagrants, right? And so you can start to begin to understand that these birds do make their way to these islands, even if it's very rare. Additionally, thrushes have made it to the island. The two on the right are actually my photos of the Oma'o from the Big Island and Puaiohi, an endemic thrush to Kauai. We've also lost the Kama'o, Amui, and the Oloma'o, all of which were found on the island chains. They're all actually not thrushes, but solitaires. They're from the Myodestes family, or genus, excuse me. And so again, they may not look quite like the solitaire you're used to, but they still retain a lot of behavioral characteristics. Monarch flycatchers also made it to the island. The Rarotonga monarch on the right side of your screen is the closest living relative to the Elapaios, which are little flycatchers that you find across the island chains. And monarch flycatchers came from the tropical Pacific. So now you can start to get an idea that birds came from multiple directions. And this is shown probably greatest when you look into the corvid radiation that occurred on the islands, but frankly is now functionally extinct, although there's a recent reintroduction program that is just underway right now. The alala is the last living relative of this radiation, the Hawaiian crow. They just got approval to begin temporary releases on Maui, because the Hawaiian crow was getting, when they would do releases, it was getting predated by the Hawaiian hawk, which is a buteo, no different than our red-tailed hawk. Although not closest, the closest relative of that bird is actually the short-tailed hawk from South Florida and into Mexico. But needless to say, they're now releasing them on Maui, and its closest relative is actually the rook, which is a Eurasian corvid, and they do look quite similar. And so it's not from a raven from the US or Canada. It's not from an American crow, but this is a Eurasian relative that colonized these islands and radiated. And the reason they're introducing it on Maui, I just will add, was though there are no current members of the corvid radiation left from Maui, we have fossil records that show that there was a very similar relative to the alala that inhabited Maui. And so we believe that even by reintroducing it in Maui, it'll still be able to find its ecological niche and hopefully survive. But here we are today really to talk about finches. And so you can get the idea that we've got all these radiations coming from all different parts of the world, landing on the Hawaiian Islands and diversifying. The best one, though, in my opinion, and the best example of island radiation takes form with the Hawaiian finches. So they're like Darwin's finches, but much better. And I want to point out Darwin's finches are actually tanagers, whereas the Hawaiian honeycreepers, which I will start to be using as an interchangeable term, are actually finches. And so what happened is essentially you have a common ancestor that radiated into a number of various habitat types. And with that came different mechanisms for foraging. It starts with, they started with nectar, or maybe they started with seeds, or they decided to pursue insects. And so what happens is, if you are a seed eater, you may eat the seed pods of the mamane tree. The pods are on the left and its flowers are on the right. Funny enough, if you're nectivorous, you may drink from the nectar from the flowers on the right. But if you're a seed crushing bird, you'll wait for the seed pods to develop and then come back to the tree and then eat the pods. Another famous plant on the Hawaiian Island is the ohia lehua. It's a tree, but it's a flowering tree, and these red buds just bring in so many birds when the trees are in blossom. And that's one of the best providers of nectar on the island. And then if you're an insectivorous bird, you may forage on ohia lehua, but you also may forage on koa trees, which is a endemic species of hardwood tree that when you get to the Big Island, you see this radiation really still in its heyday, if you will. These trees are covered in lichens and mosses, and insects are all throughout these branches, and birds really, really thrive with them. So what's left, though, I think is a very important question to ask. So when we started this radiation millions of years ago, one finch species, common ancestor, radiated into over 50 species of finches. As of now, we are down to 17 species, 16 if you believe that the akikiki is extinct, which I do. There's one individual akikiki left in the wild, and the rest are in captivity. So it's functionally extinct. If they can solve the problems on the islands, we may see a resurgence in them. But as of right now, that 17 now is basically down to 16. And with this, I've put X's on the left side, showing you all the species that are no longer even represented by their genus. Or excuse me, all the genuses that are no longer represented by their species. We've lost a number of birds in a very short amount of time. These Akialoas in the middle of your screen had a bill nearly as long as their body, and they, we believe, foraged on the branches or on the forest floor, poking under vegetation and on into the lichens, trying to find insects. There were grosbeaks on these islands that had just massive, massive bills. And there's only one seed-eating finch left on the main 4 islands that sort of represents that niche. But why is this happening? Why did we lose so many birds? Well, invasives really do dominate the landscape on the Hawaiian Islands, and sadly, the ones that cause the most trouble are not always the most visible. The Polynesian rat and the mongoose really do cause a lot of trouble for seabirds and for finches. The rat especially. I took that photo in pristine forest on Kauai, and there's still rats up there. But the biggest problem that we're here to talk about today is avian malaria, spread by a non-native house mosquito that was introduced with when Captain Cook arrived on the islands, or his or those who came after him. But essentially, they were unknowingly introduced to the island and yet wreaked absolute havoc. One bite from a mosquito that contains malaria essentially will kill the birds instantly within days. And the reason for this is that these birds just do not have genetic predisposition to be able to avoid avian malaria. And so when they get bit, they have no resistance, and so it just automatically kills them. And so on the left, you see an apapane, and on the right, you see a Maui parrotbill, also known as kiwikiu, and that is a bird of serious conservation concern. So without further ado, I think we should share why these birds are dying from mosquitoes, right? You can introduce mosquitoes, but these islands are very tall at points, and we call it essentially the mosquito zone, right? So the mosquito zone is what is considered the line at which mosquitoes cannot live above because it's too cold periods of the day. And anything below it is considered habitable in perpetuity. And so once that mosquito line surpasses the top of your island due to its elevational limitations, your entire island is susceptible to mosquitoes. And so Kauai and Oahu have already been topped. The mosquito line is above their maximum elevation. And so anywhere on that island is no longer considered safe for these birds that have no resistance. Maui only has a few hundred meters of safe habitat left. And we'll show you a few of those species later on. They are struggling largely due to restriction in habitat. Habitat itself exists in some cases nearly down to sea level, but these birds are high elevation loving, and that's where they breed. But yet when they try to explore lower elevations, they die. And so there's become this sort of selection mechanism that says if you leave the higher elevations, you will die. And researchers have seen this happen, unfortunately. The positive part of this, if there really is any, is that the Big Island has the most time remaining. It is higher in elevation than the other islands by quite a bit, and there is native habitat that goes quite high up the slopes that is protected. And so if there is any hope for some of these birds on the other islands, one idea could be to translocate them actually to the Big Island and just afford them some time. So with that, I think it's time we really get into the nitty gritty. Where do these birds all live? What are they? Which islands are we talking about? What conservation programs are going on? So we have this Hawaiian island chain, as you know, and we're going to start with our oldest island, Kauai. And on Kauai, we have native habitat essentially outlined in green. And anything pink, and so I have 4 of these graphics, one for each island. You'll see anything in pink or red is alien or anthropogenic areas. So it is no longer native habitat. It cannot really sustain large numbers of Hawaiian honeycreepers. It's all infested with mosquitoes to the degree that these birds will not survive if they leave these high elevation areas. I want to point out, though, that these birds that we're going to be talking about in all of these slides historically were believed to go all the way to the coast in most cases. I will not say all. I don't think that's a good sweeping judgment to make. But needless to say, the islands, when they did not have mosquitoes, had diversity extending much farther down slope than what we see nowadays. And so this has all changed within a couple hundred years. But where the arrow points today in this graphic is the Alakai Swamp, which is bordered by the Nepali coast, a beautiful, beautiful coastline. And you can see I'm basically at the top, one of the higher elevation points of the island. You can already see water. And this is what the swamp looks like. So these forests are cloud forest almost, pristine, covered in mosses, covered in lichens, just dripping with water because of the moisture. And that's where these birds are thriving right now. And imagining these forests much farther down slope both makes me very sad and also, gives me some hope at some point that maybe we can try to reverse some of these trends. So any photo that doesn't have any name under it was taken by me. This was one I took actually heading into this forest to look for some of these honeycreepers that you'll see right now. The biggest ticket item right now in the conservation sphere is the akikiki. There's one individual left in the wild. I posted a video of this on Instagram about a week ago. It was filmed by a researcher about a week ago. And he believes that that's the last one, essentially. There's about 100 and a handful left in captivity. They're not doing great. They're not breeding very well in captivity. And so if we can't solve this mosquito issue really quickly, then akikiki may just fall to the wayside, unfortunately. Right on its heels, though, is the akake'e, also known as the Kauai akepa. There's an estimate of about 635 individuals left in the wild. It's quite vulnerable, though, and places that you used to be able to see this bird 5 years ago from road systems, you now no longer can even find it there. You have to hike miles into the forest and hope to get lucky. This bird stumps researchers left, right, and center. It doesn't breed well in captivity at all. There's very few of them left in captivity, and they've even watched it in the field, essentially grabbing food from one mountain ridge and then flying as far as they can see, 5, 6, 7 ridges away to then maybe go feed nestlings or build nests or whatever. Their range is not something that you can replicate in a small space. And so, again, these are dynamic ecosystems that require immense amounts of space for these birds. And frankly, captivity is not a good place for them. And yet, given the hazards of the wild, that may be the only option. On Kauai also is the anianiau. They're considered stable right now, but there is some concern from researchers that this is going to be the next bird facing steep decline. And we're not quite sure how rapid that's going to be. But essentially, I would argue if you can solve the problem for the akikiki, the anianiau will benefit, right? Because they're all sort of tied up under the same issues. Working on Kauai to save these birds is the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project. They do a number of things, including interactive programs with communities, as well as captive rearing of akikikis if they can. They do field work to understand mosquito distribution, the hazards facing these birds. And so they're the partner on Kauai that's really putting their nose to the grindstone to try to help these birds. So we'll move to Oahu quickly. At the end of this, I'm going to explain sort of the high level direction everything is going for these islands, but I think it's important we walk through each island to understand what's present. On Oahu, there is native habitat. Unfortunately, there's only one endemic that's left there, though. And the native forest is still beautiful and lush and lovely, but the only endemic left on the on Oahu is the Oahu amakihi. And this is an interesting story that I wanted to bring up here, but actually holds true across a number of these islands. There are a few species that somehow have become resistant to avian malaria. We're not quite sure why or how, and it would be a great question to look into, but they are resistant, and the Oahu amakihi appears to be stable. They're still not, I mean, dripping from every tree, but if you go on a hike within an hour from your car, you can often find them. Another bird that I'll show later on is the apapane, and that is also showing to be resistant to avian malaria. And so those are two birds that we kind of could use as benchmarks for what the world might look like if mosquito densities went down, because they are doing all right. They're not precipitously declining. But sadly, on Oahu, there used to be the Oahu o'o. There's a number of other honeycreepers that used to be found on Oahu, including EEV itself, all of which are either extinct from the island or extinct globally, right? Oahu o'o, only found on Oahu, extinct from mosquitoes. EEV, extinct from Oahu, still found on Kauai, Maui, and the Big Island, but nearly extinct on Kauai now too. So they are very susceptible. So with that, we're going to move to Maui, and Maui is the other sort of hotspot right now for serious conservation issues. The arrow here points to the Waikamoi Preserve, which is just in the foothills of Haleakala National Park, which, as you can see from this graphic, it's a little small maybe, but that gray part below the arrow indicates subalpine and even higher up alpine terrain. And that really does look like that when you get there. This is Haleakala National Park from one of the overlooks. But just below this, in that cloud bank, if you will, is the Waikamoi Preserve. And this preserve is managed by the Nature Conservancy, but they do it, they work together with the National Park System, because Haleakala is a national park. And so our partners there are working sort of closely with numbers of different organizations to try to preserve the birds and the habitat. Very similar, though, to the habitat on Kauai. You'll notice a lot of ferns, a lot of lichens, a lot of mosses. Again, very cloudy, misty habitat, very lush and wet. On Maui, you have 3 endemic honeycreepers that are the focal points. The Aluahio is also known as the Maui creeper, is actually showing to be stable and not as susceptible or vulnerable to avian malaria. But the biggest ticket item right now is saving the kiwikiu, or the Maui parrotbill. Excuse me. There's 135 of them remaining. They're in rapid decline. I took a photo of the one on the left back in 2014 when I was able to go in there with my mom on a hike in Waikamoi. That photo you just saw. The photo on the right is a lot better and shows that color of this bird. But this is sort of one of the cherished birds of the islands, and it's facing serious decline. They're in captive breeding programs. There's been some attempted releases that were not successful. One of which was in a different area from the Waikamoi Preserve in an attempt to establish a second breeding population. And what happened is they realized essentially that after they released the birds, the area had somehow become infested with mosquitoes. They reached the area, and the birds then all fell to avian malaria and died very shortly after. The bird that I think is one of the best from the islands entirely is the akohe-kohe. It's this insane honeycreeper that just blows your mind away. It's probably 8 inches or more long. It's almost like a small robin-sized honeycreeper that walks through the canopy. They've got this super crazy adaptation for drinking nectar and spreading pollen, as you can see from the tuft in the front of their head. But this flame nape, this sort of black, gray, smoky plumage Just remarkably colored bird. There's only about 1,600 of them remaining, but they're in such steep decline too, because they're restricting themselves essentially to an altitudinal barrier. They will not move upslope into suitable habitat because evolution has told them they can't go higher than a certain elevation. And yet the bottom level of that elevational gradient every year is moving up, because one thing I forgot to mention is with climate change, our mosquito line is moving up every year because of a warming environment. And so every year that mosquito line moves up, the Akohe Kohe essentially finds itself pinched into a smaller and smaller elevational band of forest. And at some point, when the mosquito line goes over its high elevation gradient or restricting bound restriction, they will have no safe space and will falter. These birds have been seen by researchers flying from their safe areas above the mosquito zone downslope into suitable habitat in their first year of life, and they never come back. So we know that these birds are trying to explore other opportunities for food and simply cannot make it because mosquitoes have inundated all the environments. So that's Maui. On Maui, we've got the Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project, and they are working closely to save the Maui birds. They do a lot of replantings, again, community outreach and captive breeding programs, and they are helping manage the Alala reintroduction program as well, the Hawaiian crow. And so they're a partner that FiRN, Matt, and I have worked closely with. And I've actually, I went into Waikamoe actually with the volunteer in the middle, on the middle right photo, or excuse me, the middle photo on the right on the green shirt, Laura Bertbold. She helped us find these birds back in 2014 when they weren't so endangered. Nowadays, it's very hard to get access to see these birds because they're in just restricted areas, and researchers are panicking, if you will, for what's going to happen to them. And then on the Big Island, we move now to the island that has the most honeycreepers left on it. And here we have two habitats of focus I'd like to share. One is Hakalau National Wildlife Refuge, the arrow on the right, and the other is the Palila Discovery Trail and its environment on the left. They serve very different purposes for different birds, and we'll go through both of them. Hakalau National Wildlife Refuge is this wonderful reforestation project that it took off about 40 years ago, spearheaded by Jack Jeffrey, a colleague of Matt and I's, and a local conservation icon. Essentially, it was a grassy slope on the ridge that then got replanted by volunteers. And now 40 years later, you have mature koa trees covered in mosses and lichen, and with them, the endemic birds have come. And when we look at the Palila Discovery Trail, though, very different ecosystem. It's this dry mamane forest. If you remember that the seed pod photo I showed at the beginning with the yellow flowers, those are all mamane trees that you see in this photo. And the Palila, the only seed crushing finch left on the major island chain, the four major islands, I should say, inhabits this area, and that's it. So when we talk about the Big Island, it's important that we highlight the Hawaii amakihi. They are stable, also resistant to avian malaria, and they're doing quite well. Eevee, though, sort of the textbook Hawaiian honeycreeper that we all know. They're found on the Big Island, but also Maui and Kauai. They're extinct on Oahu, and I know people who've seen them on Oahu as of the early 2000s, and they were the last ones to see them. So this is all happening very short amount of time during our lifetimes, even my lifetime, and I'm not very old. And yet I've seen, you can talk to people in the field that have seen this happening. They're stable on the Big Island, fortunately, as well as Maui, but they're rapidly decreasing on Kauai. And I just want to point out how highly adapted these birds are. Prior to all these extinctions and range restrictions and all that, Eevee used to be one of the major pollinating birds on the islands, and they sort of co-evolved with the lobelia flowers that have diversified across the islands. And when I was on Kauai, I actually found a lobelia flower that had fallen from a tree, which is in my hand on the left. And if you notice, the shape of that flower perfectly matches the EEV bill. And the problem that's now happening is that there's no longer EEVs where there are lobelia flowers, and there's no birds to pollinate them. So the flowers are now going extinct and the trees are going extinct because the birds are going extinct. And so this is a sort of, everything's sort of falling apart as we lose our birds. Apapane, I had mentioned earlier, it's this bright red honeycreeper. They are actually found on all 4 of the major islands, and they're stable across the range and resistant to avian malaria. So it's sort of one very small win, if you will, for conservationists. But then when we get into the Big Islands endemic species, here you have the Hawaii akepa, known to be stable, highly vulnerable though. All that would really happen is if that mosquito line moves too high or habitat degradation continues, given what we already have left, they'll be one of the front runners.
Just add a,
Yes,
sorry, go
please.
ahead, Nathan.
No,
I
no,
was
no,
just
go
gonna
ahead,
add that Keppa genus is Loxops. So it has a slightly, so a similar genus is Loxia for crossbills. This bird actually has, a Keppa has a slightly crossed bill.
Absolutely. And what's even crazier here is I just want to keep reiterating. I mean, I guess I've sort of neglected to make this point firmly, but every bird you've seen here since I started talking about the Hawaiian honeycreepers are finches, right? These are all finches. And so we're talking about crazy radiation and diversity. So you've gone from an akepa to the next bird, the Hawaii creeper, the alavi, which walks on the branches of trees, pokes its bill into various crevices of lichen and mosses, and eats insects, right? But the akepa is eating within buds. Basically, it's using its crossed bill, like a crossbill, to find insects or to find nectar in sort of recently budding flowers. They can get into nooks and crannies that other birds can't. The Hawaii creeper is also stable, but also vulnerable. Habitat restrictions really are going to be the issue facing the Big Island. And so reforestation efforts are sort of paramount. The Akiapola owl, crazy name, an even crazier bird. I'd argue this sort of line of the radiation is I am most fascinated by, and is the most fascinating one. There's about 1,900 of these estimated in 2009. That number could be lower. We're not entirely sure. But I'm just going to digress for a moment as to how this bird has adapted to eating. It's a passerine bird that's about 5 or 6 inches long. So it's kind of big and it's plump. It's not a very sleek bird. And what's fascinating about this individual is if you look closely at that bill, it's got 2 totally different tools that it's going to use to forage. The bottom mandible is basically shaped like a woodpecker bill, and the top mandible is more of a honeycreeper bill, curved for insect foraging techniques. So what they'll do is they'll grab a branch with their feet, and they'll use the bottom part of their bill and hammer a hole into the tree branch to try to essentially loosen the bark or create an opportunity for it to grab the insect that it's detected inside. But instead of then just grabbing it and pinching it and pulling it out, it'll actually use the top bill and sneak that curved hooked portion of the bill into the branch and then pull out the insect, and that way they can then eat it. And this is so nuanced of a technique that it's actually never been replicated that we know of in the natural world outside of the Hawaiian Islands and outside of this species. What blows my mind even more is that this is a passerine bird that is familial, right? Essentially, their young will follow them up to a year after hatching. They'll follow the parents through the forests to learn how to use their bills, because when they're born, they actually have no idea how to eat. And so you don't see this much in passerine birds. Essentially, most birds, once the young have fledged, are sort of left to their own devices, perhaps within a few days. This bird sticks around for over a year with its young. And so they form these little family groups that will actually fly through the forest that you can sometimes see when you visit Hakalau National Wildlife Refuge. When we talk about the Big Island, though, it's important that we highlight our partners there, Friends of Hakalau Forest, who are working on the reforestation effort there. This photo on the bottom before and after truly indicates the amount of work that's gone in to the conservation success of the area. And I guess I don't know if we should call it a conservation success until they did their replantings, because at the beginning it was essentially pasture land. And then once the plants began getting taken care of and being placed in the ground by volunteers and were left to flourish, then they created a forest. And so now, 40 years later, they're still doing replantings. They're trying to expand Hakalau's boundaries. And there is an endowment fund that they're working on right now in an effort to try to make this sustainable for a number of years in the future. And Jack Jeffrey, our partner and local guide also on the Big Island, works very closely with Friends of Hakalau Forest. Actually, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, and we just sent a little bit of money, Finch Research Network, to Friends of Hakalau, and also, like Nathan said earlier, we sent a little bit to the Maui Forest, recovery project as well. There's 6 species of honeycreepers still on the Big Island, so it's by far, I guess at this point, it's kind of seen as the last refuge, and
Right.
there's talk of if it gets to the point of the mosquitoes continuing to climb up on the other islands, will they be translocated to possibly Hakalau? Right. So we'll see how the current efforts, the conservation efforts that are going on, which I think we're just about to get into.
Yep.
How successful those are will be a big determining factor on, I guess, next steps of what we hope to try to do to save these birds.
Absolutely. Right before we get to that conservation action that's in place right now, I just want to share that we also have partnered with Dr. Hart and his lab out of the University of Hawaii Hilo. Matt actually and the Finch Research Network through Cornell sent Dr. Hart some autonomous recording units, and you can sort of see what those are on the right, to monitor forest bird song in Hakalau National Wildlife Refuge. And so there are researchers on the island actively working on all these problems. They just really would love more support and help and encouragement from the mainland. They feel that there's been a lot of neglect, unfortunately, that's happened here. Not neglect, I should say, but so much, I guess it's just people don't really know about what's going on there. And in their mind, it's in their backyard. It's in their everyday sort of line of thought. And for us, it's, across half the Pacific.
And that's why we're doing these presentations,
exactly.
is try to raise awareness. Yep.
And the biggest issue on the Big Island that we haven't even really figured out what's going on with is the palila. This is, Matt can share with you, this is the last seed-eating finch that looks like a finch on the major 4 islands that we talk about here. They're very big. I mean, they're like a pine grosbeak in size and shape, and yet there's only about 300 of them remaining. Rapid decrease, talked about very little amongst the conservation community because the problems facing them are very different. And I'll just highlight them for a moment. The Mauna Kea Forest Restoration Project is run in part through the Hawaiian Department of Forest and Wildlife. And they manage the Palila Discovery Trail that also is co-managed by a bunch of other partners. But the biggest issues facing Palila are ungulates as well as cats, right? So there's sheep on these islands that hunters have stocked that are feeding on all the mamane trees, essentially denuding them of leaves. And then as well as that, you've got cats running rampant through these forests, predating nests. And on the left, you can see some scat that they found with palila feathers in it. So it's proven that that's happening. And so an effort to keep the ungulates out is one model that we can use. Another is to try to rid these islands of these feral cats, which is a much harder lift. And so many of us worry that palila is going to blink out before people even recognize it's on its brink. I would argue it is on its brink. and conservation organizations are talking about it more, but as we have seen with other birds in this presentation, many of these organizations have talked about a number of these species for decades, and just now are we finally making some headway. Okay, so now let's talk about what's happening today. You've got all these partners working on all 4 of these islands. What are they doing? So they have basically lumped under one organization right now called Birds Not Mosquitoes, which is a multi-agency partnership working to protect native honeycreepers from extinction. Birds Not Mosquitoes is largely funded by the American Bird Conservancy, in partnership also with the Nature Conservancy, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, universities, everywhere in between. All these forest bird recovery project teams, as well as Friends of Hakalau, are involved here. But the Birds Not Mosquitoes organization really is working on Maui and Kauai to save the birds. And how are they going to do this? They are currently, as of a few weeks ago, releasing mosquitoes on these islands, but not the type of mosquitoes that you might think. When we look at the Culex house mosquito that exists on all these islands that's causing all of this avian malaria and all this death and destruction, it's important that we recognize that it has a type of bacterium in its stomach known as Wolbachia. When a male and a female mosquito mate with compatible Wolbachia strains, down to the genetic level, if those strains are compatible, their eggs will then be fertile. They'll hatch, form larvae, pupate, and then form actually adult mosquitoes that can then go out and reinfect birds. What Birds Not Mosquitoes is trying to do and actively working on doing is releasing incompatible mosquitoes. They're going to release male mosquitoes. One thing that I want to point out is male mosquitoes cannot bite, nor do they will they spread this malaria, but they especially cannot bite, so that's the biggest thing. And they're being grown in labs to have incompatible Wolbachia strains in their stomachs, so that when they mate with females on the islands, the eggs those females will lay will be infertile. And with that, then you break the trend. You have no larvae, no pupae, and no more mosquitoes. And so the idea really here is to decrease the mosquito volume on these islands. And rather than spreading chemicals left, right, and center, or trying to, as you could imagine, trying to rid these pristine, moist forests of water so that these pools, these vernal pools of mosquitoes don't grow, is essentially an effort in futility. We do believe that releasing mosquitoes to help change the trend might be the solution. And so the goal here really is that instead of a mosquito line, you just have an island. The whole island is habitable. Now you've got birds going from the top to the bottom of the island, everywhere in between. No birds are dying because of avian malaria, and they're allowed to flourish in the habitats they call home. So Matt just had mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll let him chime in about this project.
So yeah, we have, I teamed up with Lillian Stokes. It's going to be her 36th guide. This has been a lifelong love of mine, studying finches and writing about finches, but we have a finches of United States and Canada. You can actually order it right now on Amazon, pre-order. It'll be out in September, and we kind of cover the main 18 species in North America, or in, United States and Canada that breed, but we have also 8 vagrants and then the 17 remaining honeycreepers in this. And you can see Palila is on the cover. I'm super excited. Dream come true. A lot of work. Literally just finished the last round of edits. Well, last round of edits until the next round of edits, but it's the it's the last big push of edits happened today, because it'll go to print here within the next 7-8 weeks. But very exciting. Can't wait for people to be able to get their hands on that.
Yeah.
And we have a research and conservation section, how to attract finches. We also have an eruptions and movements chapter as well. But we have a special section on research and conservation that covers the Honeycreeper Project, or the Honeycreeper crisis, the Evening Grosbeak Project, and also a Rosy Finch Project, and then kind of broad Fringillidae research topics that haven't really been solved yet.
Love it. Love it. And yeah, I mean, this is sort of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this tropical Pacific ecosystem that is so beautiful. And this is a photo, no Photoshop in this at all. I took this basically from my car on Kauai of Waimea Canyon. And this is on Kauai. It's right nearby where you end up going to see a lot of these honeycreepers. And this is this paradise that we're trying to conserve and allow to flourish. And so we hope that this sort of highly informative talk of just a bunch of information about these honeycreepers and the things that are being done to save them helps you. But should you want to get involved, by all means, please feel free to reach out to us. You'll probably see me in the field at some point or another, but you can reach Matt and I here. We're happy to drop these emails in the chat. But what I want to leave you all with is this graphic of the organizations that we believe could use your support. Obviously, FiRN is going to continue to contribute to these Honeycreeper projects. But if you want direct impact right now, all of these organizations, all three of these, really could use your help. And
let's drop those in the chat because a couple people asked what
absolutely.
organizations.
Yep. And so I just wanted to finish with a quick point, which is reforestation is important. Conservation of the habitat's important. Captive breeding is important. Accessible researchers getting into accessible habitat or inaccessible habitat's important. But at the whole, the biggest initiative being undertaken right now is this Wolbachia project with mosquitoes, because we do believe that no longer can we just survive in a world with avian malaria flourishing on these islands. And so these organizations are the ones working hardest towards that, under the Birds Not Mosquitoes umbrella. And so all the birds you just heard about today will all be benefiting from that project. There's a lot of intertwining factors, as you might imagine, but right now, Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project and Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project are in the field releasing mosquitoes, taking measurements of the success of those mosquito releases, and trying to figure out really what they can do. And those mosquitoes, by the way, are being flown from California because there is no growing facility to have them on the islands. And so funding here is just, I mean, it's a very high level fundraising lift that the American Bird Conservancy has done in accordance with the governments as local and federal, along with the Nature Conservancy. But it's only taken since 1778 for us finally to realize that this is irreversible. And it now really does feel like it is an all hands on deck situation. And so Matt and I are hopeful that this presentation can at least be a small vessel to communicate the conservation crisis as well as the needs of these islands with all of you. And should you ever want to go there, I'd be happy to give you advice on how to see some of these remaining birds. But with that, I don't know if Matt, you have some final words.
I mean, just, this is why we were always, I mean, any organization we talk to, and this main reason why, again, Nathan and I decided to do this is a lot of people just aren't all that aware of this here in the United States and Canada. And if this doesn't work, this Wolbachia project, the very, very last frontier is potentially GMOs. So hopefully we don't have to get there, to that level, but hopefully this project will work and we'll be able to get the house mosquito population under control. Well, yeah, why don't we copy and paste those over into the chat, and then we can field some questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat. Yeah, definitely drop those links in because there was people asking about that. Thanks, that was fantastic. Appreciate everything you provided, all the information. Going back, a couple of the questions have already been answered, but going back to Katerina asked a little bit ago that the Akiapola'au, is that how you say it? Seems very corvid-like. I'm wondering if the increased sociality shows up in other attributes on that bird, that species.
That's a wonderful question. I'm just going to reread. I was going to copy and paste stuff, but I'm going to make sure I understand that. So,
yeah.
Can I admit, I actually am not sure I know. I'm trying to figure out quite what we're asking here. So we're saying they're corvid-like. Matt, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Well, I don't know. And again, this is a little fuzzy. I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't. Is this species one that has a very small brood? I thought it only
Yes.
had, and that's a big reason why we're even more concerned about it. So I think it only raises 1 or 2 young per year because of the amount of parental care involved, if I remember correctly. So they do form flocks to learn from one another, but I think the big reason is, also the decrease is because they don't really have a big brood. But I could be wrong on that, but I think I'm right.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Let me look at that though. I'm trying to look it up now to see if I have that right. But go ahead.
Very good question.
Yes, very good question. But let me look it up. Any other questions?
We'll tackle another one while we're on this. Are there any other species affected by the mosquitoes outside the finches? So, not to my knowledge. The Elapayo seem to be doing all right. I need to sort of think about why that would be true, because like it's not a body size issue. When you think about the OOs, I mean, they were very large birds that were no longer able to resist avian malaria, and yet these small little thrushes are seemingly okay. I do wonder if it's a matter of nesting habits and where they spend the majority of their time. But if they spend a lot of time on the ground, it's not mosquitoes so much as it is rats and other pests on the ground. A lot of the seabirds seem to really be taking a hit due to the cats and the mongoose. The forest birds really are affected by the mosquitoes at these high elevations. I see, so Elizabeth, I just want to point out, I did put in the chat the 3 organizations that I'm recommending engagement with, should anybody be interested. And then Jeff Bilski asked, are there any theories as to why the Amakihi were able to develop avian malaria resistance? And it doesn't seem to, I haven't been able to narrow down quite why they were able to form resistance. I really do wonder if it was a natural selection issue and they just happened to get lucky. I did find a paper online about it. And perhaps I really do believe that that's what happened. I'm just going to read you a quick synopsis here, though. They found that Amakihi that inhabited lowland areas of the islands are and historically have been differentiated from the birds of high elevations. And they have unique markers in their genetics that through time basically might have contributed to that resistance. That the high disease pressure at low elevations probably rapidly selected for this resistance to malaria at low elevation, and that once that led to small pockets of birds, eventually they were able to spread, and so now a lot of the birds that are left are resistant.
And it's not that they don't get it too. They actually do get it. They just are able to survive with it. So it's interesting. I was right on that, by the way. The thought is it's 1 egg per clutch.
Yeah.
For occupoly.
And they'll take that young around for over a year. So
yeah.
It's a low turnover rate also. If that egg fails or that clutch fails or the young bird dies, it could be a very long time before another one's hatched. So
exactly
that low density of them is probably going to be their downfall if mosquitoes end up making it up high enough. Just scanning through the chat. Are agencies using biological means to interrupt? Yes, that's what they're doing. From a question. So yeah, what efforts are being used to eradicate rats, mongoose, and feral cats? Great question. There are measures that are in place on the islands in the native habitat to eradicate rats, which seem to be the largest concern. When I was on Kauai looking for some of the honeycreepers, we actually stumbled upon an area where they had some rat traps, and they're these pressurized traps where essentially they have food in them. And when a rat goes to eat the food, it's sort of gruesome, but let's just say the rat dies very quickly. And the traps are able to reset without anybody in the field doing it. And so they're able to exist and take care of rat density that way. But I don't think the state doesn't have at present firm laws in place to encourage eradication of feral cats, which is, in my opinion, quite a problem, especially for the seabird colonies that they're working on restoring. And so what really seems to happen is that any area that they want to keep protected, they have to build these predator-proof fences that are huge lifts that cost so much money to build. Essentially, they have to be dug well under the ground in order for an animal not to be able to burrow under it, as well as also be able to block anything from climbing it or getting over it. And these are all animals that are known for climbing and burrowing and everything in between. And so, these fences cost a lot of money. And so one area that we saw on Kauai when we were driving around had a predator-proof fence, but it was only probably, I would argue, like 400 square meters. And that area is where they're placing sound recordings of various seabirds that they're trying to attract to the island, specifically to that safe zone, so that if the seabirds come, when they nest, they're safe because they're within that fence rather than outside of it. I thought that was really remarkable, and then also sort of felt very hopeful, if you will, given that there's so much habitat across these islands, that trying to get a bird to pinpoint down to the speaker area could be a little difficult.
One of the main reasons why the Hakalau Endowment Fund has been started is there is just the maintenance of that fencing to keep ungulates out, as that last frontier on Hakalau at the higher elevations, that, as Nathan showed in that picture, really came back and has flourished.
Right.
And there's some incredible habitat there at this point. And again, that's kind of one of the parallel things going on, is like, all right, if this doesn't work here, do we need to move what's left over to Hakalau? But it's a significant amount of money to try to maintain and continue to manage Hakalau and keep ungulates out and other things out of there.
Right. Jeff Bilski's asking if prevalence of other invasive bird species put any additional pressure / competition on any other native birds. The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to be as serious as any of the other factors weighing on these birds, but when you get into native forest, the first layer of it, you find yourself, let's say with Kauai, you'll first find yourself in a forest full of Japanese bush warblers. Lower elevations, you're inundated with white eyes that are no longer swinhoes. What are they called now? Anyways, there's a white eye introduced to the islands. They're nectivorous, right? So if they overlap with any of the nectivorous birds, they're competing for flowers. The bush warblers sort of seem to drown out a lot of song. I don't know if that really impacts how these birds are communicating. The saddest thing that I didn't even highlight here is that most of the birds on Kauai have now essentially lost their song and are now singing one randomized song sort of together. They no longer can sing, thank you, warbling white-eye, not swinhoes. Akikiki doesn't have a distinct song anymore when it compares itself with maybe Iiwi or the Amakihi or the Akeke'e. They used to have different songs that researchers would be able to use to find the birds and maybe use playback when there were more of them. Now it doesn't even work. And so researchers don't even trust their auditory field studies in order to get population dynamics on these birds, because they don't know what they're really hearing anymore. You may hear what you think is an akikiki, and then it turns out it's actually not. And that's all because of these really, really low population densities at this point. That's just causing yet another set of problems. And that's not stuff that can just be relearned. So I know that we're probably getting close to time / we've gone over
Yeah.
depending on what our time is.
No, this has been fantastic. I think unless anybody else has a question, we covered everything that was in the chat, and this was a fantastic presentation. We thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for doing this for us, and we'll definitely hope to follow up and hear how the efforts are going. We'll make an effort to follow up through our iOS newsletter. So thank you all to everyone who came tonight. If you are not familiar with some of the efforts that iOS is doing across the state, we publish the Meadowlark magazine. We do the speaker series. We have a series of walks and field trips and those sorts of things across the state, including the upcoming Gull Frolic, which is currently sold out for 2024. So look forward to 2025 for that. We also do our shorebirding weekend in August and some other field trips across the state. So keep an eye out for those things. If you're not on the mailing list, join iOS and get on that mailing list, and you'll be able to be a part of all these events. So thank you very much to Matt and to Nathan for this fantastic presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at the next time.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Nathan.
Yep, you're welcome. Thanks, Nathan. Thank you, Illinois. Yeah, have a good one. Bye-bye.
You too. Thanks. Bye.